The moment she started yelling, I knew this wasn't going to be normal. She marched up our driveway like she owned the place, phone already pressed to her ear, shouting about eviction, violations, and how she was calling 911 right now. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Someone started recording. My wife stood beside me, calm, silent, unreadable. That contrast would matter soon. This woman introduced herself as the head of the WA, flashing printed papers like weapons. She claimed we were illegally occupying our own home, that we had ignored warnings, and that police would remove us immediately. Her voice echoed down the street, sharp and confident, fueled by absolute certainty. She wasn't asking questions. She was issuing commands. I tried explaining, but she talked over me. Every sentence ended with a threat. Every gesture screamed authority. She dialed 911 loudly, making sure everyone heard. Yes, I need officers immediately, she said, pacing. These people are refusing to leave. My wife didn't react. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She just watched. That silence seemed to irritate the Karen more than anything. She turned her anger directly on my wife, accusing her of hiding behind me, of pretending not to understand. She demanded IDs. She demanded compliance. She demanded obedience. And still, my wife said nothing. Her calm felt almost unsettling, like she knew something no one else did. The sirens arrived faster than expected. Red and blue lights washed over the houses, the trees, the Karen's face. Her confidence doubled instantly. She straightened her posture, rehearsing victory. She smiled like someone who believed the ending was already written. 2 patrol cars stopped. Officers stepped out, hands resting calmly near their belts. The Karen rushed forward, speaking rapidly, pointing, interrupting herself with excitement. The officers listened, nodding politely. One of them finally turned toward us and asked a simple question. Before I could answer, my wife stepped forward. She reached into her purse. And everything began to change. My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She simply opened her purse and pulled out her wallet, flipping it open with calm precision. The officer leaned in casually at first, expecting a driver's license or ID. What he saw made his posture change instantly. His expression hardened, then sharpened, then went completely still. The Karen kept talking, completely unaware. She waved her WA papers again, insisting officers remove us immediately. She laughed once, confident, almost smug. The officer raised a hand gently, signaling her to pause. She didn't notice. She was too busy winning the argument in her head. My wife spoke quietly, just enough for the officers to hear. She stated her name, her title. Then she closed the wallet and waited. No drama, no threats, just facts. The second officer stepped closer. The first officer's radio crackled softly as he asked for confirmation, using a tone far more formal than before. The Karen finally realized something was wrong. Her voice trailed off mid-sentence. She looked between the officers, then at my wife, then back again. Is there a problem? She asked, irritation creeping into her tone. The officer didn't answer her right away. He was listening carefully to his radio now. There was a pause, a long one. Yes, sir, the officer said into the radio. Understood. When he turned back, he addressed my wife with clear respect. Ma'am, he said, nodding slightly. The shift was instant and unmistakable. The Karen's face tightened. Her confidence cracked, just a little. The second officer straightened his uniform and asked my wife if she needed additional units notified. That's when the color drained from the Karen's face. Additional units, she repeated, confused. For what? No one answered her. The neighbors had gone silent. Phones were now clearly recording. A police cruiser down the street adjusted position, lights still on but sirens off. The Karen took a step back, suddenly unsure where she stood. I called you, she said sharply. You're here because of me. Her voice wavered despite the anger. They're the problem. The first officer finally looked at her. His tone was calm but firm. Ma'am, we're going to need you to stop for a moment. That sentence landed like a punch. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Her eyes darted back to my wife, who stood quietly, hands relaxed at her sides, expression neutral. There was no satisfaction on her face. No smirk. Just control. The Karen swallowed hard, and for the first time since she arrived, she realized this situation was no longer hers to command. By now, the Karen's hands were shaking. She tried to laugh it off, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the WA had authority, that she was only doing her job. The officer listened without interruption, eyes steady, patience thin. When she finished, he asked for her identification and requested she step aside. My wife remained still, allowing the process to unfold. Another patrol car arrived quietly, parking behind the first. A supervisor stepped out, glanced once at my wife's credentials, then immediately addressed her by title. That single word echoed across the driveway like a verdict. The Karen's posture collapsed, her shoulders slumped, papers drooping at her side. She attempted to interrupt, but the supervisor raised a finger, firm and final. He explained that false emergency reports were serious, that misuse of authority carried consequences, and that intimidation of residents would be documented. Neighbors leaned closer. Whispers spread. Phones stayed raised. The street felt smaller, tighter, as if the truth compressed everything inward. The Karen's earlier volume seemed ridiculous now, an overplayed role exposed by daylight. She tried again, apologizing rapidly, blaming confusion, blaming the WA board, blaming outdated rules. Each excuse piled onto the last, growing heavier. The officers took notes. The supervisor asked clarifying questions, each one precise, each answer recorded. My wife finally spoke again, calm and controlled. She asked that the situation be handled professionally and without spectacle. She requested no special treatment, only accuracy. The supervisor nodded, appreciative, and assured her that procedure would be followed exactly. That was the moment the Karen understood the difference between power borrowed and power earned. Her threats had depended on noise and assumption. My wife's authority required neither. It existed quietly, unquestioned, and everywhere at once. The supervisor turned to the Karen and explained the next steps. There would be reports. There would be follow-up. There would be consequences decided later. Today's confrontation was over. As officers prepared to leave, one neighbor lowered their phone. Another shook their head slowly. The Karen stood alone, smaller than she had arrived, staring at the driveway she once tried to claim. My wife walked back to my side, squeezed my hand, and whispered that it was finished. The sirens never returned, but the lesson remained, echoing down the street long after the lights disappeared. Later that evening, messages flooded our phones from neighbors, thanking us for standing firm and exposing abuse. The WA board went silent. Emails stopped. Notices vanished. Calm replaced chaos. What lingered was relief, mixed with disbelief, that authority had finally answered arrogance, and that one quiet decision had protected an entire street from future intimidation. It became clear that respect follows truth, and real power needs no shouting, no threats, only accountability and calm resolve always. The next morning felt unusually quiet. No emails, no notices taped to doors. No WA patrol car cruising the street like it owned the pavement. The silence itself was confirmation that something fundamental had shifted. Word had traveled fast, faster than the sirens ever did. By noon, neighbors were stopping by, sharing what they had heard, filling in pieces we never even knew. Apparently, the Karen hadn't just embarrassed herself. She had triggered an internal review. Her emergency call was flagged. Her statements were replayed. Her authority claims were questioned. And her pattern of behavior, documented quietly by others over months, finally had context. Our driveway had simply been the breaking point. By afternoon, the WA board issued a carefully worded email. It spoke about miscommunications, procedural corrections, and temporary leadership changes. No names were mentioned, but everyone understood. The tone was apologetic without admitting fault. It was damage control disguised as professionalism. My wife read the email once, then set her phone down. She wasn't interested in revenge. She never was. For her, authority had always been about responsibility, not dominance. She believed systems worked best when people remembered their limits. This incident had reminded an entire neighborhood of that truth. Days passed. The Karen never came back. Her name disappeared from WA communications. The sudden absence felt like a storm passing, leaving behind clean air and cautious optimism. Neighbors smiled more. Kids played longer outside. Doors stayed open. Fear had quietly left the street. One evening, as we sat on the porch, a neighbor thanked my wife for handling everything the way she did. Calm, controlled, professional, no yelling, no humiliation, just consequences. My wife smiled politely and said she hoped it would prevent future problems. That was all she wanted. The lesson lingered with me. Power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't need threats, volume, or paperwork waved like a weapon. Real authority waits, it listens, and when it moves, it does so with precision. That 911 call was supposed to remove us from our home. Instead, it removed an illusion of control that had been harming everyone. The Karen learned it the hard way, but the neighborhood learned it together. Sometimes, the most satisfying justice isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, it's orderly, and it restores balance without ever raising its voice. A week later, the full consequences finally surfaced. An official letter arrived by certified mail, addressed to the WA board and copied to us. It explained that the emergency call had violated state guidelines, that false claims of authority were under review, and that corrective action was mandatory. It wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. The board responded quickly. They announced mandatory training, revised complaint procedures, and a suspension of enforcement actions until everything was reviewed. For the first time, rules applied equally. The imbalance that once favored intimidation was gone. Neighbors felt the change immediately. People who had avoided meetings started attending again. Questions were asked openly. Decisions were challenged respectfully. The fear that once kept everyone quiet had lost its grip. One neighbor admitted she had received eviction threats over parking. Another said he had been fined repeatedly for imaginary violations. Stories poured out, each one adding weight to what had happened in our driveway. The Karen hadn't been an exception. She had been a symptom. My wife listened without judgment. She never interrupted. She reminded everyone that systems only fail when people allow abuse to go unchallenged. Silence, she said gently, is often what empowers the loudest voice in the room. The board eventually removed the Karen's authority entirely. Her role was reassigned, then quietly dissolved. No announcement, no apology, just absence. And somehow, that absence felt like justice. The neighborhood began to heal. Trust rebuilt slowly, conversation by conversation. Kids biked freely again. Neighbors waved instead of watching from behind curtains. The street felt like a community, not a checkpoint. One evening, my wife and I walked past the same driveway where it had all begun. The memory lingered, but it no longer carried tension. What once felt threatening now felt small, almost unreal. That's when it hit me. The Karen hadn't lost power that day. She had never truly had it. What she lost was the illusion that authority could be claimed through noise alone. My wife never spoke about her position publicly. She didn't need recognition. Her calm had done more than confrontation ever could. It set a standard others could follow. That 911 call changed everything, not because of sirens, but because truth finally met arrogance face to face. And truth didn't need to shout. As weeks passed, the incident became more than neighborhood gossip. It turned into a quiet case study of how power can be misunderstood and misused. People began asking deeper questions, not just about the law, but about how often authority is assumed rather than earned. Conversations changed tone, becoming thoughtful instead of fearful. The revised WA meetings felt different. Chairs filled, voices were steady, no one whispered anymore. Rules were discussed openly, not enforced blindly. The absence of intimidation created space for fairness, and fairness invited participation. It was a transformation no policy alone could have created. My wife attended one meeting, briefly, only to clarify boundaries. She reminded everyone that law enforcement exists to protect rights, not settle personal grudges. Emergency services, she explained calmly, are not weapons to be used in private disputes. Her words weren't scolding, they were instructive. The room listened. After that night, enforcement letters stopped entirely. Instead, there were notices asking for dialogue, for compromise, for understanding. Small conflicts were resolved with conversations instead of threats. The shift felt almost unbelievable. One afternoon, a neighbor approached me quietly and admitted something that stayed with me. He said he had once considered moving away because of constant pressure from the HOA. He thanked us for staying, for not backing down, for showing that intimidation only works when people accept it. That gratitude carried weight. The Karen's name rarely came up anymore. When it did, it was spoken cautiously, like a lesson rather than a person. No one celebrated her removal. No one mocked her fall. The community simply moved forward, wiser than before. My wife returned to her routine, handling statewide responsibilities with the same calm discipline she'd shown that day. To her, the driveway confrontation wasn't extraordinary. It was a reminder that professionalism matters most when emotions run high. Watching her, I realized something essential. True authority isn't loud. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand obedience through fear. It operates quietly, confident in its legitimacy, prepared to act only when necessary. The street looked the same, but it felt different. Safer, lighter, more honest. The balance that had been missing was restored without spectacle. That single 911 call, intended to force us out, had instead forced a reckoning. Not just for one woman, but for an entire system that had gone unchecked for too long. And in that reckoning, everyone learned a simple truth. Power reveals itself not in how loudly someone speaks, but in how calmly they stand when challenged. Months later, the story resurfaced in an unexpected way. A new WA leadership team invited residents to a town hall, promising transparency and accountability. Attendance was higher than anyone remembered. People came not out of fear, but curiosity, ready to shape something better together. The meeting opened with acknowledgments, not defenses. Past mistakes were named carefully. Procedures were clarified. Limits were set. The emphasis was on cooperation rather than control. It felt unfamiliar, but welcome. During the discussion, someone asked what had truly changed. The room grew quiet. Eyes drifted toward my wife, seated near the back. She didn't volunteer an answer. She never did, but the silence itself spoke volumes. A board member finally said it aloud. People aren't afraid anymore. Heads nodded. That simple statement captured everything. Fear had been the unspoken rule, the invisible enforcement tool. Once it disappeared, the structure had to change or collapse. After the meeting, neighbors lingered outside, talking easily. Someone joked about parking rules. Another suggested a block party. Laughter replaced tension. It felt like the neighborhood had exhaled for the first time in years. Walking home, my wife reflected quietly. She said authority becomes dangerous when it's detached from responsibility. Titles mean nothing without accountability. Systems fail when they reward volume over integrity. Her words were calm, thoughtful, and free of bitterness. I thought back to the driveway. The shouting, the certainty, the phone held high like a weapon. It all seemed distant now, almost unreal. Yet its impact was everywhere, woven into the way people interacted, spoke, and listened. A week later, the WA published new guidelines. Clear escalation paths, explicit limits on enforcement, mandatory conflict resolution before any emergency call. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress born from a hard lesson. The Karen's role was never mentioned again. No one speculated about her future. The story no longer needed a villain. It had become something larger, a reminder of what happens when unchecked authority meets quiet competence. One evening, a neighbor asked my wife if she ever felt tempted to use her power more often. She smiled gently and shook her head. If I had to, she said, something would already be wrong. That answer stayed with me. Real authority isn't about winning confrontations. It's about preventing them. It's about building systems where respect replaces fear, and where power is exercised sparingly, with care. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that honesty had been earned, not demanded. As time went on, the incident quietly left our street and entered broader conversations. Neighbors shared the story with friends. Friends shared it with coworkers. Not as gossip, but as a cautionary tale. It became an example of how easily authority can be abused, and how quickly it collapses when exposed to truth. I noticed how people told it differently. Some focused on the Karen's arrogance. Others emphasized the police reaction. But the part that stayed consistent was my wife's calm. That stillness, that refusal to escalate, resonated more than any dramatic confrontation could have. One afternoon, a new family moved in 2 houses down. At the welcome gathering, someone casually mentioned how different the neighborhood felt now. Safer, kinder, more open. The newcomers smiled, unaware of the history beneath their feet. And that felt right. A community shouldn't be defined by its worst moment. The WA continued functioning, quieter and more restrained. Meetings became shorter. Enforcement became rare. When issues arose, they were discussed face to face. The system hadn't been destroyed. It had been corrected. My wife never followed up on the Karen personally. She never checked outcomes beyond what procedure required. For her, closure didn't come from seeing consequences handed down. It came from knowing the system corrected itself without bending. One evening, she explained something to me that clarified everything. She said power becomes dangerous when people forget it's temporary. Titles change. Positions rotate. What remains is how people are treated while someone holds authority. That, she said, is what people remember. The memory of that driveway still surfaced occasionally. The sound of her voice. The sudden silence. The realization. But it no longer carried anger. It felt instructive, like a lesson learned and filed away. I realized then that the Karen hadn't just misjudged my wife. She had misjudged the entire idea of authority. She believed it was something you could declare, something you could shout into existence. She learned, painfully, that real authority is recognized, not announced. That recognition had protected our home, but it had also protected the neighborhood from repeating the same cycle. Future leaders would remember. Residents would speak sooner. Silence would no longer be the default. The story's power wasn't in the shock of the reveal. It was in the aftermath. In the way calm dismantled chaos. In how accountability restored balance without humiliation. That's why the story endured. Not because someone was embarrassed, but because something was fixed. And that, I understood, was the rarest outcome of all. The story eventually stopped being about the Karen entirely. Her name faded, her actions reduced to a reference point rather than a focus. What remained was the impact. The way one reckless decision reshaped how an entire community understood authority, accountability, and restraint. People often asked us if we felt satisfied. If it felt good to see someone lose power so publicly. The honest answer was no. Satisfaction was never the goal. Stability was. Safety was. Fairness was. Those things don't arrive with applause. They arrive quietly, once fear leaves the room. Looking back, the moment that mattered most wasn't when the police arrived or when credentials were revealed. It was the moment my wife chose not to react emotionally. That single decision prevented escalation. It kept the situation grounded in truth instead of ego. It allowed systems to work the way they were meant to. That driveway confrontation could have turned into chaos. Raised voices, arrests, lawsuits, headlines. Instead, it became a correction. A reset. Proof that professionalism still matters, even when provoked. The neighborhood never returned to what it was before. It became better, more aware, less tolerant of intimidation. People spoke up sooner. Leaders acted more carefully. Authority was questioned respectfully instead of feared blindly. As for my wife, she never mentioned the incident again unless asked directly. To her, it was one of many moments where responsibility outweighed emotion. She didn't see herself as the hero of the story. She saw herself as a participant who did what her role required. That humility was the final lesson for me. Power doesn't belong to the loudest person. It doesn't belong to the one holding the papers, the title, or the phone threatening consequences. Real power belongs to those who understand restraint. To those who know when to speak, when to listen, and when to let systems function without interference. The Karen thought calling 911 would force obedience. Instead, it forced clarity. It exposed the difference between imagined authority and legitimate command. It reminded everyone watching that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. In the end, no one was evicted. No one was arrested. No scene went viral that day. But something far more important happened. Balance was restored. And sometimes, that is the strongest ending of all.